A warm welcome to all of you. Good evening, everybody, to this session of the Oxford Interfaith Forum on Medieval Liturgical Psalters. My name is Caroline Gluchowski. I'm a DPhil candidate at New College and fellow of the Oxford Interfaith Forum, and it's my pleasure to be today's host and chair of the session. It's my pleasure to introduce to you today's speaker, Dr. Elizabeth Solopova. She's a lecturer at the English faculty and at Harris Manchester College at the University of Oxford. She specializes in medieval literature and has published widely on Old and Middle English language, literature, and manuscripts. Her recent research has focused on medieval biblical and liturgical texts, particularly Latin liturgical psalters and the Wycliffe Bible, the first complete translation of the Vulgate in English. Elizabeth, we look forward to your presentation and the stage is yours. Please feel free to share your screen.
Thank you very much, and I will now share my screen. Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me and for the introduction. And I want to say a few more words about my credentials and why I'm giving this paper. I published a few years ago a catalogue of medieval liturgical psalters in the Bodleian Library in Oxford. The Bodleian has a very important collection of medieval psalters from different countries, dating from the 9th century and later. The catalogue has over 100 descriptions of different manuscripts and covers Latin liturgical psalters, but not vernacular translations of psalms. And this is what I'm going to do in my talk today, even though my current work is primarily on medieval translations of the Bible in English. But it would have been very difficult to cover both translations and Latin psalters within an hour. So I'm going to focus on Latin liturgical psalters, leaving translations for some other time. So what is the liturgical psalter? It is a service book that contained psalms, but also other liturgical and devotional materials. Although its core text is the Old Testament book of Psalms, it should never be thought of as simply a biblical text or simply a book for reading. It had a clearly defined structure that reflected its liturgical function. In its basic form, it included a calendar followed by 150 psalms, followed by the canticles for daily offices and the litany of saints. If any of these components are missing, we can be sure that they were removed because they were absolutely standard components of the Psalter as a liturgical book. This basic structure, calendar, psalms, canticles, and litany, can be seen in its pure form in early medieval psalters, and sometimes in psalters from the late Middle Ages, particularly those made for lay rather than religious patrons. Books made for the religious patrons in the late Middle Ages for monks and priests tend to be more complex and include other texts in addition to this basic model. Additional texts that were commonly included were prayers, hymns, various offices, calendarial and computistical texts and tables, and introductory texts explaining the significance of psalms. Psalters were used primarily by the clergy. Both secular and monastic clergy recited all 150 psalms in the course of each week. But psalters also played an important role in private lay devotion. The Psalter functioned as a prayer book for laity until the 13th century, when this role passed to the Book of Hours. As a result, psalters were produced in relatively large numbers throughout the Middle Ages for use in public worship as well as for private use by religious and lay patrons. Psalter is the most commonly preserved liturgical book from the Middle Ages. I will now say a few more words about the textual contents of psalters and show you some examples. So the first item is usually a calendar. This is a calendar page for September from a manuscript in the Bodleian Library made in Bruges in the middle of the 13th century. This is absolutely typical, and English libraries, including the Bodleian, have quite a number of 13th century psalters from Bruges and Ghent. These towns flourished economically and artistically and seem to have housed workshops that specialized on the production of luxury liturgical manuscripts. These workshops produced illuminated psalters with simple textual contents, probably aimed primarily at wealthy lay patrons. So presumably English merchants and diplomats who visited Bruges would stock up on various luxury goods and also sometimes commission something like this to take home. So what can we say looking at this calendar? It is decorated with what art historians call the labors of the months, miniatures depicting traditional occupations for the time of the year. This is very typical for calendars from the Low Countries, England and France. This particular picture shows a young man sowing winter crops. As a book for all seasons, Psalter tells you what you should be doing in September in 2 weeks' time. This is a standard medieval Christian liturgical calendar, apart from the fact that it is quite empty, has many blank lines. This again suggests that the book was probably made for a lay rather than a religious patron. Calendars made to be functional, to be used in a monastery or a secular church, tend to be more densely populated with feasts in the late Middle Ages. In addition, as you can see, the feasts are not graded. In calendars made for professional use, feasts were normally graded through the use of color. The most important were written in gold and red, and sometimes blue was also used to emphasize significant feasts. But here, everything is in black. The feasts are also not classified in any other way. More sophisticated calendars would typically indicate a number of readings for each feast. So the name of the feast would be followed by a Roman numeral. This kind of detail, the presence or absence of grading and the number of readings for different feasts, help us to understand what kind of patron the book was made for. Other features that suggest that a psalter was made for a lay patron are errors and inconsistencies in the calendar and litany. For example, a calendar and a litany that have a strange mixture of feasts and do not correspond to any local use or the use of any institution, or a calendar and litany that are clearly out of date for the time when the book was made, because of course liturgical customs changed, new feasts were introduced and sometimes replaced earlier ones. Another feature that indicates that a psalter was not made for professional use is the lack of agreements between a calendar and a litany. For example, an English calendar and a litany for the use of Bruges. And I have certainly come across all these situations. More expensively produced psalters contained full-page miniatures after the calendar, and this particular one has a prefatory cycle illustrating the life of Christ, including this picture of Nativity. This is an optional feature, an addition to the basic model, but quite a few psalters have it. The life of Christ is not the only, but a very common topic. And this is another miniature of Nativity from a German 13th century psalter. Such cycles depicted the life of Christ from birth to death and resurrection, as you can see in this page from an English 14th century Psalter. It shows crucifixion, descent from the cross, burial, and resurrection. Such images focused attention on biblical history, but also evoked the time, the seasons, and the progress of individual life. And we should remember that in the Middle Ages, Psalter was in many cases the only book that people owned, and that accompanied them throughout their lives, first as a primer of their education, and I will say more about this, and later on as a sacred and at the same time a very personal object. Psalters have a strong connection with time in all senses, liturgical seasons and hours, biblical and human history, and human life. It is indeed a book for all seasons. But returning to the textual contents, the calendar and sometimes miniatures are followed by the Psalms. The version of the text in liturgical psalters is most commonly Gallicanum and occasionally Romanum. I haven't come across Hebraicum in liturgical psalters, but Romanum does occur, and not only in psalters from Rome or elsewhere in Italy. In scholarly literature, it is often claimed that the Romanum text was used in Anglo-Saxon England, but not in England in the late Middle Ages. But this is not quite true. The Romanum version continued to be used in some cases in England, even in the late Middle Ages. So if you are working on Psalter, it is always worth checking what text it has. A great majority of liturgical psalters are in the biblical order, though there was also a limited tradition of presenting psalms in the order in which they were recited during the week. And as you may know, this differed drastically from the biblical order. Such psalters are known as ferial. Ferial order was difficult to reproduce in a book because psalms and parts of psalms were used in more than one office during the week. There was no single accepted way of doing this. Ferial psalters are rare, and the majority come from 15th century Italy. They all differ somewhat in how they present the psalms. Psalms were rarely numbered in medieval manuscripts. The numbering that you occasionally see in the margins, as you can see here in the left margin, that Roman numeral, these are usually modern editions added by 16th and 17th century readers, and this number is certainly not in a medieval hand. In the Middle Ages, psalms were known and referred to by their opening words rather than numbers. I'm going to move on now, but we'll come back to this image. So in the absence of numbering, medieval readers were assisted by textual divisions in the Psalter, signaled by larger and sometimes elaborately illuminated initials, as the one that you have just seen on my previous slide, and occasionally also by the inclusion of miniatures. The initials marked psalms that were particularly important in the weekly liturgical cycle. But there is complexity here, because there was more than one way to recite psalms during the week, and therefore more than one way to subdivide the Psalter. As you remember, psalms were recited in daily offices in an order that differed significantly from the biblical order. There were two traditional orders in which psalms were recited during the week, known as the secular use and the monastic use. The secular use was employed mostly by the secular clergy, though with some exceptions, and the monastic use mostly by the monastic clergy, though again with exceptions. What is shown here is the most common way in which liturgical psalter was subdivided, and it is based on the secular use. So larger initials occurred at psalms that were recited first at matins during the week, and at Psalm 109 that was recited at first at Sunday Vespers. And by the way, you may have noticed that I use the Vulgate numbering of Psalms, as is the custom of scholars who work on medieval Bible, and so I apologize to those who are more familiar with other numbering. So this is the traditional eightfold division based on the secular use and most commonly found in liturgical psalters, but this is not the only one. In the monastic use, different psalms were read first at matins during the week and at Sunday Vespers, and there are psalters that emphasize these psalms. And there are endless variations beyond this. Thus, in England and Low Countries, eightfold division was often combined with the division into 3/50, resulting in a tenfold division of the psalter. The division into 3/50 is apparently of early Irish origin and is found on its own in very early psalters, or combined with eightfold division in later psalters. And this is what we have in Liturgical 369, manuscript from Bruges that you have already seen. And this is not unexpected, so tenfold division is typical for England and Low Countries. And to add further to the complexity of the situation, the fact that the eightfold division was based on the secular use does not mean that all psalters that have it were made for the secular church. It became traditional and was used in psalters made for monastic patrons as well. Generally, it is useful to pay attention to liturgical divisions in psalters because they can tell us about the patronage of a book and where the book was made. Eightfold division was very common, but any deviations from it are potentially interesting. Some initials at liturgical divisions were often illuminated using traditional iconography. The best known and the most common program of illumination was what is known as the Parisian program. It developed in France at the beginning of the 13th century and became widely used in Europe in the second half of the 13th century, replacing earlier local traditions. It remained popular until the end of the Middle Ages. Parisian program is based on the eightfold division according to the secular use, so pictures appear at the psalms shown here. This program almost certainly contributed to the popularity of the eightfold division. Parisian program is also known as the literal system of illumination because it was based on the literal illustration of the opening words of Psalms occurring at the 8 liturgical divisions. It also focused on King David as the presumed author of the Psalter. Thus, Psalm 26, shown here, begins, "The Lord is my light." On the Parisian program, it had a picture of King David pointing to his eyes, as you can see in this 14th century Psalter from the north of England. This well-known image of King David pointing to his eyes was used again and again to illustrate this psalm, as you can see in this early 15th century Psalter made in Norwich. Psalm 38 begins with "Dixie, I said," and on the Parisian system, it had King David pointing to his mouth. Psalm 52 begins, "The fool said in his heart," and it had a picture of a fool, usually on his own, but sometimes in conversation, debating with a cleric, as here, or with King David or Christ. The fool was variously portrayed, sometimes as a beggar or a barely clothed madman, as here, sometimes as a courtly jester, and sometimes through some kind of a mixture of the two approaches. When he is a jester, he often wears a hood with bells and holds a bladder on a stick. And when he is a madman, he is frequently shown holding a club and either holding or eating bread, because Psalm 52 mentions the evildoers who devour the people as men eat bread. Miniatures depicting this common subject differed widely in detail, leaving plenty of scope for the artist's creativity. In addition to being decorative, they functioned as a mnemonic device or a finding aid, considering that the psalms were not numbered and were known by their opening words, and the images illustrated these opening words. As I mentioned, the Parisian program became dominant in Europe in the 13th century. In England, it largely replaced an earlier program of illumination based on analogy between the events of the Old and New Testaments. In spite of its popularity, however, it never completely eliminated other ways of illustrating the Psalter. There were local pockets of resistance to the Parisian influence, and in the Netherlands, Davidic cycles coexisted with Christological and hagiographical cycles, where initials contain scenes from the life of Christ and saints. And here you can see the second temptation of Christ in the initial of Psalm 26. This is the Psalter from Bruges that you have already seen. And this is an English Psalter with an Old Testament scene in the initial of Psalm 68, Jonah being swallowed by a whale. In addition to being a service book, most commonly surviving from the Middle Ages, Psalter holds primacy in yet another way. They are the most commonly and richly illuminated of all medieval liturgical manuscripts, and probably of all medieval books. But returning to textual contents, the Psalms in liturgical psalters are followed by the Canticles and the Litany, and this is the beginning of the 6 Old Testament or daily canticles, starting with Confiteor. Confiteor is in the last paragraph, so there is a large illuminated initial C of Confiteor, the first of the canticles. This is a 14th century Psalter from northeast of England, and here is the Litany from the same Psalter. And we will come back to this image a little later. One of the very striking aspects of the liturgical Psalter is its tendency to have a very long, useful life, serving different owners, sometimes over several centuries. This is not really surprising, considering that they're usually formally written and are therefore highly legible, as well as very beautiful books. Psalters are almost always written in book hands, different versions of textura, and almost always on parchment. This is one of the Bodleian Library's great treasures, an Anglo-Saxon Latin Psalter written in Winchester in the second half of the 10th century, with added interlinear translation into Old English. There is evidence that many medieval psalters were still in use in the 16th and 17th centuries, and sometimes even in the 18th century. Earlier psalters were often updated and supplemented in medieval and early modern hands to bring them in line with changing liturgical practices. In fact, it is very difficult to find a psalter without medieval or early modern additions and modifications. There is also what Eamon Duffy, in his account of the Books of Hours, described as devotional personalization. This is a tendency of late medieval and early modern owners to customize their books through the addition of texts such as personal prayers or the records of family births and deaths, as well as through the inclusion of commissioned portraits, devotional images, and memorabilia. In many cases, psalters were treasured personal objects that reflected events of their owners' lives. In this psalter, at Psalm 101 shown here, there is a portrait of a lay woman in blue robe and white veil, kneeling before an altar in an architectural setting. This is almost certainly the patron who commissioned the book. When some initials were decorated with the portraits of the owners, they most commonly, or patrons, they most commonly occurred either at Psalm 101 or at Psalm 119. Psalm 101 is one of the 7 penitential psalms, appropriately beginning, "Lord, hear my prayer," whereas Psalm 119 is the first of the gradual psalms that were often included in the books of hours and recited by laity as an act of devotion. We don't know for whom this book was made. The calendar, this great treasury of liturgical and historical information, is unfortunately missing. This limits research that we can do. But there is a litany, and this is not as informative as the calendar, but it can provide some very useful information. And this litany contains saints venerated in the north of England, such as Cuthbert and Dunstan. Also, in the litany, invocations of St. Peter and St. Augustine are doubled, which is a sign that they were particularly important to the recipient of the Psalter. The doubling of the invocation of St. Augustine you can actually see on this slide if you look at the line, at the 4th line from the bottom of the slide. So this is St. Augustine, and his name is followed by the Roman numeral 2. So this is that doubling of the invocation. The liturgical divisions in this Psalter are in accordance with secular use, and the Augustinian liturgical cycle was based on the secular use. Note the psalms that are emphasized in this book. So we have the 8 traditional divisions, but also psalms recited first at all Vespers during the week and at none during the week. They're all highlighted, as well as the division into 3 50s, being a book from England, and the beginning of the gradual psalms. So there is a tendency in scholarly literature to see 8 liturgical divisions according to secular use as standard and essential for Christian liturgical psalter. But don't believe anyone who tells you that the 8-fold division is the only one. There was a lot of variation, and divisions were useful. They assisted readers to navigate the book in the situation when the psalms were numbered and pages were numbered, when the psalms were not numbered, pages were numbered, leaves were numbered, but because the books were handwritten, of course, the same text never appeared on the same page. So readers needed other navigational aids, and divisions were such an aid. So a book with a more sophisticated system of divisions is easier to use. So the divisions shown here are consistent with Augustinian use. So perhaps this Psalter was made for a lay woman depicted in the initial of Psalm 101, and the patron may have had Augustinian connections, and the book was made either for personal use or for presentation to an Augustinian religious house dedicated to Saint Peter. In the remaining time, I want to discuss non-liturgical uses of Psalter. Psalter is a service book, but this is not everything. Psalters had numerous roles in the lives and activities of their owners. They served as a primer of medieval education and were also used in what can be described as popular religion, prognostication, or even magic. Psalters' role in education is very well attested. They were used by people to learn to read and pronounce Latin. Occasionally, liturgical psalters contain the Latin alphabet, either added or in the hand of the original scribe. Some psalters include elementary prayers expected to be learned by children, such as Our Father and different creeds. Images to do with literacy and reading were also commonly used. An open book on a lectern is traditionally depicted on the Parisian program in the initial of Psalm 97, which begins with, "Let us sing to the Lord." It was frequently illustrated with the figures of singing clerics, sometimes including children. And in this connection, I would like to draw your attention to Dow's 239 in the Bodleian Library. It was produced in the north of England in the third quarter of the 12th century. The text is written in red, green, and blue, and the color changes with every line. It is used decoratively. And in the calendar, the situation is the same. The calendar is written in exactly the same way. The color changes with every line and is used decoratively rather than for grading, rather than to highlight important feasts. The calendar also contains a number of inaccuracies and unusual omissions. Some feasts are ended on wrong days. Such errors would be unusual in a monastic calendar, but were not uncommon in books produced for private lay use. Another feature which suggests that the recipient was a layman is the choice of psalms highlighted with larger illuminated initials. This is Psalm 21, starting with the words, my God, why have you forsaken me?" It formed part of lay devotional reading, but had a less important role in the monastic divine office. The Psalms in Dow's 293 are preceded by striking miniatures illustrating the life of Christ, which would have assisted a layperson's study and memorization of biblical stories. This picture shows the Nativity with all the usual participants, including the Virgin Mary lying in bed and a midwife sitting next to the bed. The portrayal of a midwife is somewhat unusual, though not unknown in nativity scenes. Unfortunately, there is no evidence that the Psalter was made for a woman. The evidence rather suggests the opposite. There are no Northern or Anglo-Saxon female saints in the calendar and the litany. Some miniatures in the Psalter have references to literacy and reading, like this Annunciation, where again, somewhat unusually, it is the angel who is holding a book. In spite of the decorative approach, the text in Dow's 293 is written very carefully. As you can see, each verse begins on a new line. Such layout was common, but not ubiquitous. The script is large, and there is a general spacing between the lines. The text is carefully punctuated and was diligently corrected by the original or contemporary scribe. This combination of features, care about correctness and legibility on the one hand, and also interest in the decorative presentation and making the book fun, make it possible that the Psalter was made for a child from a wealthy, noble family. And finally, I want to say a few words about popular religion. There is evidence that psalters were used in trials by ordeal and were carried by their owners as amulets, but psalters' connection with popular ritual is most evident in their contents. Scholars have long noticed that there is an overlap in the contents of medieval liturgical and medical manuscripts. Medical collections could include liturgical material, such as instructions to recite particular prayers and psalms, whereas liturgical books could contain scientific and medical texts. This slide shows two recipes from an early 17th century treatise in the Bodleian Library. The first recipe tells you how to calm a baby that is crying and cannot sleep. All you need to do is to write down Psalm 8 and put it on the infant's right arm, and the child will sleep quietly. The second text tells you how to catch birds using Psalm 103. And note that you must use virgin parchment. No trashy palimpsests are allowed, as you can see. What I said about popular religion can be illustrated using this psalter from the Bodleian Library. It is a portable monastic psalter, probably made in York at the beginning of the 15th century. It is a very small book, only about 20 centimeters long and 8 centimeters wide. The first original item is, of course, the calendar. And it is a calendar for the use of the Benedictine Abbey of St. Mary in York. We know this from the presence of characteristic feasts. There is not just one, but 3 feasts of St. Benedict, as well as the feasts of the archbishops of York and saints venerated in the north of England. As you can see, the translation of St. Cuthbert is here. This is on the 3rd of September at the top of the page, close to the top of the page. And it is written in red as an important feast. This calendar is also nearly identical with the calendar in another Bodleian manuscript, a Book of Hours from the same monastery. The calendar is followed by psalms, canticles, and litany, but there are also additional texts. This is a book almost certainly made for a monastic patron, so we expect more complexity and sophistication. And there are 2 prologues to psalms explaining their significance, a hymnal, the Office of the Dead, and what is known as monastic canticles, a set of Old Testament passages that were recited as part of monastic liturgy on Sundays and feasts during the year. The contents are typical for a monastic psalter of this date, but though it must have made for the Benedictine Abbey, it seems to have been in lay hands in the early 16th century. So perhaps the most interesting aspect of this psalter are additions made by the owner on an empty leaf facing the first page of the calendar. And I wanted you to show the image of this page. But in fact, I'm showing the transcription of the text. There is an English poem added in a 16th century hand. The poem reads in late Middle English: Christ was born in Bethlehem and baptized in the river Jordan. The river was raging or angry. The child was good. The child with the right hand blessed the water, the flood, the water stood still. So does this day or night, this man's blood in the name of God, St. John, and the baptism that Christ took in the river Jordan. This poem is a well-attested charm to stop bleeding. The earliest versions of a similar Latin formula date from the 9th and 10th centuries. It is based on a legend that the river Jordan stood still during the baptism of Christ. The English poem appears in different versions with a variable number of lines in several Middle English manuscripts containing medical recipes. In an early 15th century manuscript in Trinity College, Cambridge, it has a title, "To Stop Bleeding." Blood charms were used by women in childbirth, and this one seems to have been particularly associated with women, and this manuscript provides further evidence to support this. There is a very faded inscription in metal point on an empty leaf at the end, at the back of the manuscript, that reads Elizabeth. It is very faded and difficult to see, and when I noticed it first, I thought that I may be imagining things, seeing my own name in a medieval manuscript. I thought maybe I need a break, and when I come back, it won't be there any longer. But it is definitely there, and the Bodleian did a very good job taking these photographs using special technology. It is not ultraviolet, but it is multispectral photography. So in addition, the calendar contains a note in Latin in a 15th century hand that records the birth in 1465 of Princess Elizabeth of York. This is the daughter of Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville, and the Queen of England as the wife of Henry VIII. Considering all this, it would be very tempting to think that there is a connection between this Psalter, the blood charm, and Elizabeth of York, that it may have belonged to her, particularly since she died at the age of just 37 from a postnatal infection, 8 days after giving birth to her daughter, Catherine Tudor. The connection, however, is probably, unfortunately, only indirect. The poem and the name Elizabeth, and unfortunately I can't show you the poem, but the poem and the name Elizabeth are probably in the same hand. But it is not the hand of Elizabeth of York or her mother, Elizabeth Woodville, whose autographs do survive. The notes recording family births and deaths are, of course, very common in the calendars of late medieval liturgical books, but this particular inscription perhaps suggests an interest in astrology rather than simply a wish to record a family birth. It gives very precisely not only the day, but also the hour of birth. The precise time and the day of the week, as well as the date of birth, were required for the casting of horoscopes. In addition, the wording prima genita, as you can see here, firstborn, suggests that the inscription was made sometime after the birth of Elizabeth of York, when she was no longer the only child. If this were written at the time of her birth, the wording would have been different, perhaps something like una genita, the only born. So all this takes us outside the royal circle, but it is very likely that in the 16th century, this book was owned by a woman whose name was Elizabeth, who added a blood charm on an empty leaf, and who may have been interested in the horoscope of the Queen, whose name was also Elizabeth. And to conclude, Psalters crossed the boundary between religious orthodoxy and popular ritual, between the public liturgical sphere and private devotional practice, and even extended their presence into secular areas of their owners' lives, such as education and childbirth. Throughout their medieval history, liturgical psalters demonstrated exceptional resilience and ability to develop and cross the boundaries of ideology, confession, and social class in order to perform their many important roles in private and public lives of their lay and religious owners. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth, for this splendid and wonderful, very rich presentation on the medieval liturgical psalter. Maybe you could stop screen sharing so that we all see each other again. Thank you so much. Very, very interesting to see not only the different texts we can find in the Psalter, from the calendar and the Psalms to the Canticles and the Litany, but also how Psalters were used in the medieval society and also altered. I was thinking about the recent book of Dr. Hannah Riley, who's also a member of the English faculty, on how books were repurposed, or Kate Rudy's work on the Dutch Psalters and the modular method. I stop here and invite everybody to ask questions. I guess that plenty of questions came up during the presentation. Thank you very much, Elizabeth, for this wonderful presentation, and thank you everybody for participating in the discussion later on.
Very much. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you for all the questions.
It was a pleasure to having you with us. And I see some people sending applauding emojis. So yeah, thank you very much. I hope you all have a wonderful evening or a wonderful afternoon if you join us, Jim from Florida. And we hope to see each other again in the future soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you.